Hello, and welcome back to the Darkness Underneath podcast for episode 4 of Roy Demeo and Murder Machine. What made Roy become Roy the Monster will probably never be known, and I would like to think that his dark journey wasn't inevitable, nor do I think a serious analysis of anybody should be restricted to their dark side. He wasn't, after all, a demon. His son, Albert, insists there was a goodness in him, that he wasn't just self-serving and evil. But the reality about Roy was probably far grimmer than his son would like to believe. And the crimes he committed were probably more heinous than anything demons in entertainment have done. Forensic psychologists have found that psychopaths are significantly genetic in nature. Furthermore, they mask themselves with qualities that other people find normal or even noble in order to conceal their dissolute nature. Dr. Hervey Cleckley, in his groundbreaking work in 1941, called it the mask of sanity. So after Chubby's death, did Roy develop into something that was ever capable of caring about others? Something that wasn't entirely vacuous and self-serving? Was he capable of real empathy and love? It's worth thinking about as you hear his horrific crimes and how selfish and cruel his behavior was, even towards children, juxtaposed against the examples of the good Roy others insisted he was capable of being. By 1975, Roy had most of the practical basics of his Gemini method worked out. It was only how he was going to easily transport the bodies to the Fountain Avenue dump that hadn't yet become a part of his ritualistic murder technique. Roy envisioned a new Murder Inc., and himself as a new kind of Albert Anastasia, the High Executioner. Vicious mafiosos were at least some of the role models he had adopted in the absence of Chubby. Roy Demeo's Murder Machine, though, would be far less restricted in its targets than even Murder Inc. More serial killers in their unbridled maliciousness than Rayleigh, Strauss, and Anastasia had been. And if Roy's claims that he would make to Sammy the Bull and Dominic were more than just exaggerations, and I think they were a lot more than just exaggerations, then he would become one of the worst serial killers America has ever known, him and his crew. When he told Sammy the Bull 200, that was long before he quit murdering people. Police estimates wildly range from a low 75 to 250. Now, it was probably more than 75, probably not 250. People vanish from that area of New York City all the time, and it's impossible to know how many were from Demeo or not. It was the perfect era to become a serial killer. Whatever the real number, it's a lot higher than Roy's confirmed kills. I'm quite confident of that. And by 1975, Roy was about to unleash hell and unmitigated suffering on a lot of people. And now it's time to go back in time to the days before the internet and cell phones, to the era of disco clubs, porn theaters, go-go boots, and bell-bottoms, back when New York City was a cesspool of crime and corruption that we all miss. Just kidding. Andre Katz had just been found slaughtered and in pieces only days ago, and it's now 1975 again. Judy's body began to reclaim itself from the cold shock that had overcome her. She couldn't believe what was happening. Several days had passed since Katz was abducted. She called his work the next day, but his fiancée just sneered and said, "Isn't he with you?" She called again on Monday, and some guy named George demanded her information and promised the police would make it hard on her. She lied and hung up. On Tuesday, Henry finally called, and he always said Henry instead of hi. She asked him, "Is he dead?" Henry said, "No, he's just in the hospital. He'll be fine." But she didn't believe him. Even after 3 years of friendship, she didn't believe Henry anymore at all. Something was very wrong here. She didn't think Katz was just beat up. No, she was sure of it. And besides, Henry had already lied to her about hurting him at all. She knew she couldn't trust him, even after 3 years of friendship and fucking. Wednesday came, and she called Katz's car service shop again, but this time nobody answered. So she called the business next door, and they explained that Katz was dead. Something horrible had happened. Some kind of tragedy. Oh my God. She had been duped into helping Henry and his scary friends murder that poor Andre guy. As the shock went away, she not only felt dread, but powerful revulsion at herself for what she had done. Later, detectives started showing up at her apartment building asking for a hooker named Judy. Between her guilt and fear of both the cops and Henry's friends, she began to melt. That same Wednesday, which is when the police began releasing details about the Katz murder, Henry called again. Henry, he's dead, isn't he? Yes, Henry told the truth this time. Don't worry, though. Whenever they find you, you just say you don't know anything. Henry, I saw everything from my window. I saw somebody putting something around Andre's neck. I saw Joey. I saw the other guy, the Jewish guy, whatever his name is. Chris? Who else knows everything I know? Only you. Are you going to try to do away with me, too? Nothing's going to happen to you. What about your friends? I'm the boss. He only wished. Henry never had a problem with bullshitting. How did you kill him? I don't want to say anything about that. When Anthony Center came by her work with money from Henry so she could go to San Francisco and get away from the heat and negative attention, she took it. It was a few $100s, $1,000 in today's money, but she wasn't gone long. She decided to do the right thing. The very brave thing, considering it meant not just telling on her friend and former lover, but also a group of killers. Judy decided she would hate herself otherwise, though, that she wouldn't be able to live with herself no matter how dangerous it was. So she went down to the station and told the cops what she knew, and then got in the cop car and took them to Joey and Anthony's apartment. Since they lived next to each other, it made arresting them easy. Now you can see the homes they have above. I'm not quite sure whether the property was adjoining from the back, because it doesn't look like they connect or that they're in the same area there, but I think that they're connecting by the backyards. The first building was Henry's, and the second building was Borelli's. When they arrested them, they identified as out-of-work carpenters to hide their obvious real criminal jobs. The two crew members would spend the next 6 months in jail until their trials. Judy was then taken into protective custody until the trial was over, and she left the city in the meantime. Katz's slaughter and Henry and Joey's arrest were big news. The press seemed to love it even more because they both looked like fashion models. Now, during those 6 months while he was in jail, Henry would start fuming at Chris whenever he thought about him. He didn't feel as if Chris was doing anything to help his family, and he wasn't. He felt like somebody should have been giving them money to support his wife and kids. Of course, Demeo wasn't either, but you don't get pissed at Demeo. He'll kill you for it. In reality, it was about him resenting the fact that Chris was so close to Demeo, and when he thought about Chris, couldn't help but think, what did that cocky motherfucker have that he didn't have? Henry would even begin to entertain thoughts of killing Chris. In the meantime, Roy hired his best lawyer, Abrams, to prepare a defense for his boys, but he had other problems to worry about too until the trial arrived. He had fucked up on an assassination attempt for Nino a month before Katz, and he was still looking for this Gambino guy. You'll hear more about that next episode. Now, Roy's days plundering the Borough of Brooklyn Credit Union hadn't lasted long. He was like a vampire that drained that institution to insolvency through uncollected debts or uncollectible debts. The BCU tried to merge, but Roy's greed had attracted the government's attention. Roy's greatest fear, not another killer like him coming after him, not the FBI, but the IRS, those motherfuckers who had snagged Al Capone, had begun asking him questions and doing investigations. Suddenly, the IRS were asking a lot of questions, and he had to take Valium. To him, it was probably like birds of prey dressed in bureaucratic suits swooping down and burying their talons in him. From so many different directions at once, he wasn't sure where to swat first, and he was floundering around for a counterattack. Finally, Roy began having his friends swear in affidavits that Roy was an investor in their business. Freddie, one of the people who swore on an affidavit, told people proudly it was either do it or die, suggesting Roy had threatened him, or that he hadn't had a choice. Maybe it was just Freddie bragging about how dangerous and tough Roy was, but it would be kind of funny if Roy had threatened Freddie, because Freddie always boasted what a hero Roy was, who had saved his life on camera when a drag racing accident happened, in which, as Broadway Freddie, he had been knocked unconscious, and Roy had to drag him before the car exploded. It's also kind of funny if Roy threatened him, because Freddie would have done it anyway for him. Freddie was so obsessed with Roy, I think it was probably a bisexual love, which is fine. I have no problem with that. But would have been interesting given how much the Gemini twins, and probably Chris too, hated homosexuals, and they even wanted to kill them if they ever joined the crew, as one would later on. The affidavits were enough to save Roy from further investigation at the moment, and managed an indictment-avoiding settlement with the IRS. So Roy walked away from the credit union he had milked and destroyed like the Joker from a burning hospital. And now that he needed more money, he began selling coke out of the Gemini Lounge to raise money for his next venture. At home, he had 3 kids of his own and had taken in and raised his little brother. You might recall from episode 1, his mom moved to Italy for a while, but she came back and permanently settled in the U.S. again. She lived not far from where Roy grew up with her best friend, Miss Profaci, related to a very powerful mob boss who was dead at this time. I believe his mother died in the 60s, but I'm not 100% sure of that. And since she's not really important to this story other than the effects she had on Roy, I'm not going to look it up either. Now, in his personal life, Roy had the mask firmly secured to his face. He was the doting neighbor who always had an extra garbage bag if you needed it. If Roy was cleaning out his garage and wanted to get rid of something, he'd ask if you wanted it first. Maybe it wasn't all mask either. Maybe it made him feel like he was a better man than he really was, at least sometimes. Or maybe he enjoyed being nice sometimes. Most people aren't purely one-dimensional, and are as much subject to moods as they are fixed personalities. And honestly, I would have loved having Roy as a neighbor, even if I knew he was a mobster, so long as I didn't know about the serial killing and another horrific thing that he was about to start making money off of. Roy's place, though built like a fortification with barred windows and heavy-duty security systems, was a fun place. During the 4th of July, Roy had huge firework displays, and during the holidays, Gladys would have memorable Christmas parties, very aesthetic, and play Christmas music over the speakers. And of course, Roy loved all his kids, as I mentioned before, with doting cheerfulness that most kids can only dream of. It's like Leave It to Beaver meets Al Capone, but mostly Leave It to Beaver, and a little bit of Al Capone. Honestly, as far as dads went, Roy was the complete opposite of the piece of shit he was at work. His son Albert considered him his role model, and Roy would dress him up as Al Capone, actually. There were, of course, hints of his darker nature. He taught little Al a rhyme on how to properly kill someone. Roy's version of Little Mother Goose, which I like to call Little Roy Goose, went something along the line of 2 in the head to make sure they're dead. Most parents don't teach their little child on how to properly murder. I think he was raising Al to become a killer and an assassin like himself someday, someone he could trust, without any consideration of what Al himself wanted. But maybe Roy just couldn't get murder out of his head. It was probably a little bit of both. Now, Demeo always tried to abide by his own little Roy Goose rules when performing coup de grace. Make sure they are dead as quick as possible, with a couple bullets in the head after they're neutralized on the ground. That's a logical rule for a killer. Now, Roy had, however, quickly grown estranged from his wife Gladys. Whatever he had done to woo her into marriage had thawed. I suspect when their kids weren't around much, he was irritable, detached, and treated her like furniture. That speculation is consistent with Mustang and Capicci's claims in Murder Machine. If Roy was, as I am confident, a full-fledged Type 1 psychopath, the kind forensic psychologists get giddy about studying in prison, he might have even fantasized about killing her from time to time if he was unhappy with her too. And he was also probably emotionally abusive when the kids weren't around. But he didn't have too much problem with the marriage, because he had no problem cheating, whether it be with barmaids or prostitutes, or whatever else was available that he found attractive enough. And since Gladys didn't require much to be content, she was old-fashioned. I mean, this was a woman who grew up in the 40s and 50s after all. He probably never seriously considered hurting her. And those barmaids fulfilled some of whatever proclivities he had. He would boast to his crew that he liked to fuck these waitresses in the ass and then get them to do the really dirty stuff, whatever that really dirty stuff was. I'll let you imagine for yourself. Some of the waitresses at the Gemini thought that he was a pig, that they needed to just laugh at and brush off, and other waitresses found him funny and charming and nice, and never had a problem with him. Now, I myself sometimes wonder about the more sick things Roy might have been into, whatever they were, because I have a feeling he was into more sick things. I'm now going to comment on what one possibility could have been, and it's only speculation. During the period between 75 and 76, Roy was driving with Dominic one day. Doesn't matter where, but what does matter was Roy boasted that he had expanded his smut industry to become more competitive. He needed to maximize his profit. After all, It's not like he didn't already have a lot of money. Now, most mobsters like Nino had no problem investing in your hardcore smut like you see on Pornhub today. Gangbangs, real sex, whatever. Consensual adults having sex with consensual adults. That was illegal in New York City back then, and so gangsters saw it as a new form of business. But since Roy still didn't think the money coming in was enough, even though he had millions, he now began expanding into a new form of industry, child porn and bestiality flicks. And he'd sell them to disgusting pedophiles because to him profit was all that mattered. He'd always justify it as, I just buy and sell. There's no evidence that he himself was looking at it, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was. Now, since Roy didn't have any morals whatsoever, he was a man I believe you can rationally label evil. Whether you're an atheist or a theist or an agnostic, whatever you are. His utter disregard for the well-being of others, both adults and kids alike, deserved that label. Now, while Nino had been childless when he took Dominic in, he did later have kids in the 50s. And although he was violent and did terrible things, he did not approve of child abuse or any of this sick shit, and he became enraged when he heard what Roy was doing, and shouted at him, I don't want you selling that sick shit. And Roy, of course, said, but there's a lot of money in it. And Nino had said coldly, I'm telling you, if you don't stop, you're going to die. As much as I like doing my cartoonish voices when the subject matter is too serious, they would be inappropriate. So after their fight, Roy acquiesced and shrugged and went back to selling it anyway. And Nino, who never had any good control over Roy, eventually just quit asking where the money was coming from when it kept coming. He knew that Roy was still selling it, but he didn't press the matter. Capici and Mustang believed that Nino cared about the money more than he did the child porn, and that he was just a hypocrite. I disagree. I think he developed a love-hate relationship with Roy, and came to care about him in some weird way. And he'd only whack Demeo if he absolutely had to, such as if Castellano ordered it. But as you'll hear about the next episode, there was another reason why he wanted Roy around. Roy was his favorite weapon. Now, during the 6 months before Henry and Joey's trial for Katz's murder, Nino quit coming around the Gemini Lounge to collect his money. Now it was all Dominic's responsibility. There was just too much heat going on there. And while Dominic was stopping by one day, he asked Chris, what happened? 2 of my guys are in jail because we killed some guy who shot me, Chris said. Chris didn't bother to point out that they had been the ones to actually initiate the violence, and that they almost ripped Katz's ear off in doing so. Such details aren't important. Then we took him apart, bit by bit, Chris said. Chris's lips curled up into a disturbing grin. I'm glad you're on our side, Dominic said. January 1976 finally came, and so did Joey and Henry's trial. With Judy on the stand, the prosecutor's only real evidence, the defense wasted no time in portraying her as a coke-addicted, mentally unstable slut who couldn't be trusted to testify against anybody, let alone such fine young men. And Henry and Joey were good-looking and kept up an appearance of being good members of society. Their looks definitely helped. And they did win that trial, though maybe character assassination helped the defense win only a little bit. After all, there really was no evidence, since nothing connecting Henry or Joey to Pantry Pride or Katz could be found, and she really was their own evidence. So it was kind of a her word versus them, and that doesn't reach the burden of proof. Of course, Andre Katz's brother could have helped the case, but he was too terrified to testify. Now, personally, I would have been out for blood if somebody did that to my brother. It would have driven me nuts if those guys walked away. I don't think I'd even care about living anymore. And it is also amazing what a .44 caliber Magnum revolver or 2.9s pointed center mass can do to even the odds when they're walking home together. They lived right next to each other after all. I'm sure Anthony was with them all the time too. But I do sympathize with what his brother was going through. And this would be a problem for a lot of witnesses. Fear, who might have otherwise come forward over the years when Demeo's crew started committing crimes more often. And to be fair, it seems like the justice system was far more protective of rats who had hurt and killed people than the innocent, brave witnesses who were only testifying out of moral duty. You gotta love the justice system and how fucked up it can be. After the trial, Judy would leave New York City permanently, humiliated and traumatized. She would play a role again, though, someday, in hurting the Gambinos and Joey and Henry. But that wouldn't be for a while, not till many, many years from now, in the 80s. And by then, there'd be so much evidence against them that her testimony would probably only play a small part of their conviction. The crew threw a party at the Gemini Lounge that night after Henry and Joey were released. They would have labeled it a celebration party. Although I think of it more as a fuck you, I can do whatever I want, even though I'm an overgrown man-child whose parents weren't around to discipline me party. Most of the crew were there, and Dominic was also invited. But the real celebration was for Roy. He had gotten them released with his slick and ruthless mercenary lawyer. Professor Demeo's lesson was clear. They could destroy their enemies, make them disappear altogether, and escape punishment, so long as they were with him. The members flocked around Roy, orbiting him like a moon, and looked at him with adoration, almost worship. While Dominic was at the party, Chris introduced him to a new member of the crew. "Hey, this is Peter LaFrosca, one of the top car guys in New York," he boasted. By that he meant that Peter was another deviant in their army of car thieves. He stole, on average, 15 to 20 cars a night. That kind of makes him an Olympic champion among reprobates in the underworld, and he was absolutely loaded from stealing cars. Now, there isn't much available on Peter, in either the court records or Murder Machine or any book I've been able to find. What he was like, his personality. As you can see by the photos, if you're watching the visuals, he was bulky, had a beard, and resembled a Missouri redneck. Although he would become a top-tier member of Roy's crew because he was really good as a killer, he was cold and effective. As a person, he was otherwise either mysterious or just dull. Probably dull, since Nino didn't seem to think much of him. And Dominic found him unpleasant to be around, just as he did Chris and Joey. He didn't like any of those guys. Now, Dominic seems to be the type of guy people either love or hate. People seem to have strong opinions on him. He was a nom-vet and a former Green Beret. People dispute that. I've seen a photo of him as a Green Beret, and I think that it's accurate. And while I haven't studied his background much as far as his war record goes, since I'm more interested in what he did when he came back to New York, there's enough information out there for me to believe he was a Green Beret and that he was a very, very effective soldier, whatever the specifics. The role that Dominic played in Murder Machine isn't entirely clear, but he seems like a better guy to me than the rest of them, a much better guy. He has PTSD from some of the things he saw in Murder Machine, which he said was even sicker than the violence he experienced during Vietnam. I've actually spoken with him before. It was just a brief exchange over email, and he was polite and friendly. Now, maybe you'll come to a harsher conclusion about him than I have, but you'll definitely hear a lot about him during this series, enough to be able to form an opinion. You're going to hear much more about him next episode, when I turn my attention to Dominic and Nino, along with Roy, of course. Now, Dominic that night became close friends with Henry, and afterward they continued to have drinks together at bars. Then one day Henry called Dominic and said that they have to meet. And so they did at the pear tree, and Henry was dismayed and anxious. Now, Henry's definitely not Rhodes Scholar material. In fact, he's not only not the brightest bulb, sometimes he barely flickers. Of course, you could say that about most of Roy Demeo's acolytes of mayhem and murder. Now, well, I said last episode that I thought Henry probably had less psychopathy than the rest of the Demeo crew, a position I still maintain. That doesn't mean I didn't think that he was not a psychopath, or more precisely, a sociopath. Henry would be willing to kill you over some pretty petty shit. And being told that you have less psychopathy than the Demeo crew is a bit like being told that you're less of a psychopath than Dahmer, Manson, and Ted Bundy. It just doesn't say much. So when Henry arrived, he told Dominic, "I went to Roy and asked him if I could kill Chris." And at that, Dominic's eyes bloomed wide. "Are you crazy? Why didn't you just ask him if he could kill his son?" Henry turned pale and nodded, agreeing. He had no idea that Chris was that important to Roy, even though it should have been obvious. "Now Roy says even if Chris drops dead of a heart attack, he's going to hold me responsible. I spent all this time in jail for Chris. We killed that guy for him. And Chris didn't take care of my family. He didn't give my wife or kids anything," Henry said. "Just bury the hatchet with Chris. He'll dig his own grave someday," Dominic said. Fortunately, Henry wouldn't have to wait long to get back in Roy's good graces. Now, it's time to turn our attention to somebody who was not a member of Roy's crew. Actually, if you had asked him if he worked for Roy, he would have either laughed or punched you with the satisfaction in knowing you wouldn't dare strike him back. Most people wouldn't, even if they could beat him up. His name was Joseph Brocchini, and he was the consummate bully. Now, Brocchini wasn't your playground bully. He was much too old for that. He was a bulky middle-aged man with receding hair and a self-approving countenance. He was also a made man with the Lucchese crime family. You see, the Lucchese still had their books open. The boss, Anthony Corella, well, he was looking to make his family bigger, so of course he was making new-made men. He wanted a much more powerful family, something that could compete with the larger families like the Gambinos. Roy Demeo himself had even been offered to be made with them. He had, after all, worked with the Lucchese before the Gambinos. But the Lucchese weren't good enough for Roy. He wanted to work with one of the more powerful families, even though Gambino wasn't interested in making new-made men yet, and had no clue, even after all these years, who Roy even was. Roy was still an associate, banking on the captain of the Brooklyn faction, Paul Castellano, giving him his button after the old man, Gambino, finally kicked the bucket. But Brocchini? Well, he liked working with the Lucchese. His prospects were looking good. He would be captain, maybe even a boss someday. He was, after all, pretty young, only 43, and he was an earner. He'd been a loan shark and ran a dice game a long time ago, but now his main source of income was porn. If you wanted the hardcore stuff in magazines, the stuff where people actually fucked, then you could get it from him, his bookstores. And he had a good selection, too. If you were gay and wanted the gay stuff, come to his bookstores. Yeah, the mafia hated gays. They even forbid it among the made men. They'd kill you for it. The mobsters hated homosexuals, but not when it came to their business. The gay rights movement? It had been started at Stonewall Inn. And why? Because some mobsters who partially owned a bar, a gay bar, didn't pay crooked cops their bribes to leave the patrons alone, and so the cops raided the place in retaliation. So Brocchini was a major purveyor of pornography. His smut was pulling in $1.5 million a month. Now that's the early 70s. That's $9,300,000 a month in today's money. No, he didn't get all that, but he made a lot of it. Enough to build a huge mansion that the feds wouldn't quit asking him about. Of course, all the lawyer fees and bribes were a pain in the ass. And in 1972, one of his bookstores got raided, and Brocchini ended up being indicted by the morality cops for distributing obscene material, along with 11 other men and 6 corporations, and between them all, they'd had 560 charges. That's up to 7 years apiece if you're convicted. And at least 3 other major businesses he had gotten busted. But with his powerful allies, it made fighting the charges easier. And that bust was almost 5 years ago now, and he was still free and rich as hell. His biggest business, Bark Book Distributing, and his major smut store, Blackjack Bookshop in Midtown, well, they were a gold mine in smut money. Of course, he had to front some of his earnings. Softcore doesn't usually buy mansions. He owned a used car dealership on paper, though it was in Maryland's name. But of course, the feds still aren't convinced. So recently, Mr. Brocchini had an argument with another smut distributor, Roy Demeo, and Roy didn't show the proper respect. He must have forgotten that Brocchini is a button man, and this asshole Roy isn't submissive enough. So what does Brocchini have to do? He loses his temper and punches Roy in the face, and then he hits him again and again and again. Gave the motherfucker a black eye. Apparently Roy was wise enough not to hit back. He knew hitting a made man like Brocchini would not only end his chances in becoming a made man himself, but also mean his death. After he got the shit kicked out of him, Brocchini was pretty sure that Roy would show the proper respect, and fear him enough not to agitate him again, knowing what his status was. Then Mr. Brocchini had gone back to business as usual. That was a very serious mistake. The worst mistake that Mr. Brocchini ever made. One day during the spring of 1976, Roy showed up at Nino Gadgey's home. He was wearing sunglasses. When Dominic answered and escorted him down to the basement, he couldn't help but ask why the fuck he's wearing those. That's when Roy removed them. revealing the swollen and black bruise. And in his eyes, anger mixed with promises of murder.